All right, in this lesson, we'll play around with a few more attributes that are available on our series. Let's begin by re-executing the code that we need to import our CSV files and generate our series. So in these examples and in the last couple lessons, we've been creating these Pokemon and Google series from existing CSV data rather than on the fly. But these are still fundamentally series objects, so they still have the same attributes and the same methods available to us. Those are just default whenever a series object is created. So as a quick review, we have our values attribute, and the values attribute gives us an array of the values within the series. So there we have all of the Pokemon. Similarly, I can do the same thing on Google, and that attribute will give me an array of the values. You can see here that in this example it's also truncated, so it's going to take a break in the middle to ensure it doesn't overrun. We also have our index attribute, and that gives us information about the index that makes up that series. So we have the range index object that we explored in previous lessons, and the index attribute can be called on any series, so there it is for Google. We also have the familiar dtype attribute, and that gives us the data type of the values that form the series. So Pokemon is a series of strings, so data type is giving us O for object, which is, remember, the internal pandas keyword for a string. And if we do the exact same attribute on the Google series in comparison, we're going to get float, so it's a floating point number. There are a couple other attributes that I wanted to introduce. These may come in handy whenever you're working with datasets on your end. There is a really convenient isUnique attribute, which is going to be just is_unique, and that returns a Boolean, either true or false. And it's going to return true if every series value is unique, which means there are no duplicates. So among the Pokemon, it's going to return true because there are no Pokemon listed more than once. And if I do isUnique on my Google series, it's actually going to return false because there are days when Google's stock price was the same, and thus there are duplicate values among the series. So it's giving us false. Now, of course, that doesn't bring us necessarily closer to finding out what those duplicate values are, but attributes, again, are not for performing calculations or taking a subset of a data set so much as they just summarize a detail about the existing data set, in this case, our series. We also have the ndim attribute, which is short for number of dimensions, and a series is always a one-dimensional object because there's only one column of data. And we'll dive into this in more detail later, but whenever we use the ndim attribute, it's going to give us one when it's called on a Panda series. It's going to give us more dimensions when we work with larger dimensional objects, and we can use the ndim attribute kind of like the built-in type function in Python to get a sense of what object it is that we're working with. We also have an attribute called shape, and shape gives us a tuple of the shape, so to speak, of the existing series. Now, again, this is an attribute that is more effective when called on more dimensional objects, but what it's going to give us is the number of rows by the number of columns in a tuple. So this means that there are 721 rows, and it's not actually representing that one. That's why we see the comma and nothing there. But this basically indicates to us that the shape of our series is 721 rows by one column. And similarly, when we call this shape attribute on the Google series, we're going to get that it's 3012 rows by one column. Again, when we call this on a data frame, which is two-dimensional, it's going to tell us the number of rows and the number of columns, which is much more helpful when you have a more bigger, spaced out two-dimensional object like that. But still, shape is particularly helpful if you want to get kind of a picture of how the series looks like. We also have the size attribute, which is very similar. That's just going to give us the number of total elements or cells within the series. So it's sort of like a value count. So in Pokemon, we have 721 values, and in Google, we have, again, 3012. And an important thing about this attribute, we haven't really dived into missing or null values yet, but this attribute does count null numbers. That means that if we have a blank row, for example, in our CSV and it's being imported and it's stuck there somewhere in the middle, it is actually being counted as one of those 3012 values. But we'll dive into null values in a much later point in time. We also have the name attribute. and that is going to tell us the name of the series. This, as you may recall, is taken from the top column header within our original CSV, and it's actually what's output whenever we either preview, let's say, Pokemon. We can see it at the very bottom here, name Pokemon, or even when we do something like a head method to see the first 5 rows, we can see it appear here. And this is a unique attribute because it can actually be reassigned to. So we can do something like equals Pocket Monsters instead. And when I execute this cell and rerun the cell below to get the new head, which is the new 5 rows of the Pokemon series, we can see that the name below has changed to Pocket Monsters. So we can actually modify that existing name of that series. So those are just a few new attributes that we've introduced here. We have dtype, which we know values, index, is unique, ndim, shape, size, and name. Certainly not the full list of all that's available, but really the most popular ones that you're going to be using. And in the next lesson, we'll start diving into using a built-in method to sort the values within our series.